Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth lecture for this module. We're talking today about global markets and imperfect competition, how global markets change in some ways, some of the competitive rules we're talking about as parts of national markets. So in this lecture we'll be discussing a couple of different areas. First of all, the principles of marginal benefits and marginal costs. Then we'll look at externalities, what they are, what some of the examples of them are, and we'll talk a little bit about regulation and regulators and how they interact with some of the issues regarding markets, perfect and imperfect. So this is the first applied case for our module, where we're looking at some of the principles we talked about in the first couple of weeks, and now we're starting to apply them to a real-world examples and real-world context. Here we're looking at global markets and imperfect markets. We're looking at the way that global markets function to a certain extent and some of the issues regarding them. We're talking next week more about that in terms of globalization. So I want to kind of lead us from last week's conversation about different forms of market this week into the fact there are global markets, there are limits to some of the conditions we talked about in terms of competition and so on. And then next week we're going to talk more about globalization and trade. There are a number of questions from this week's topic that sit around it, and one of which was mentioned in the module handbook, which is what is the main purpose and role of government in the economy? In your opinion, are there any limits to the role of government in the economy? And this is one of the issues you need to be working on in the seminars, and you'll think about for your presentation, which is the first assessment piece as well. So what I'd like you to do in the seminars is to take this topic, work on it in the seminar as part of that exercise and with that case study, and then you to keep that material, put it to one side and potentially use that material to develop your presentation for your first assignment with. So last week we talked about the idea of perfect markets, and we talked about different alternative market forms as well. Monopolistic competition, monopolies, oligopolies and duopolies. We talked about how those different things didn't really have the same principles embodied as perfect markets. We kept linking it back as well to the idea of how supply is affected by these different forms of markets, and this week is another example of that. It's another extension of that. And this week we're also looking at how global markets become inherently, to some extent, more and more monopolistic and less competitive as they expand. To some extent, national regulators should be able to deal with national level monopolies, but as soon as we get into international contexts, it gets a lot more difficult for them. So first of all, I want to talk about the idea of marginal social benefits. Marginal social benefits are the benefit to society for consuming or producing one more unit, whether that is one more paving stone, one more road, one more tank, one more pack of butter, whatever it is. It's the marginal benefit of producing something additional. It's additional over and above the baseline level we usually consume or produce. Social benefits usually relate to public goods, but can relate to any private goods that have a positive social aspect from their existence as well. For example, new cancer treatments would inherently be private initially, but eventually have a social good to them. There is some kind of positive benefit to society from their existence. A little bit of an extension from that are external benefits, which are accrued to parties outside of that main initial economic relationship. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Those are externalities. A great example of a positive social benefit, which may be external to the initial relationship or initial act of consumption or production, would be higher education. Inherently, this benefits the individuals involved in higher education in terms of working in it or in terms of studying. In terms of studying, you get a better life chances, better career in the future, but also a country gets increasingly more output potential, It's more growth. It's a better place to live if people are also well educated. The flip side, of course, to marginal social benefits would be marginal social costs. These are additional costs to society from production of one more unit. It includes private and also social costs. So, for example, if we produce one more power station, we'll have one more extra unit of climate changing fumes being pumped out into the atmosphere. There are private costs and there are broader social costs as well. There can be private impacts upon individuals, but there will also be these externalities forming from this as well. These are the impacts upon broader stakeholders in society. And these are quite often wrapped up in terms of looking at public policies, how the impact of different policies factors among society, among different actors in society. Thinking about how we talked about supply and demand, there was an equilibrium level we could achieve, whereby supply and demand equaled each other. Same thing can be achieved with marginal social benefits and marginal social costs. With the MSB is less than the MSC, we can produce more. There is more benefit to be achieved from doing it, and we're not being costed too much by doing that. The benefits outweigh the costs. Where the marginal social costs outweigh the marginal social benefits, we need to produce less to stop causing that amount of impact on society and not getting any benefits from doing so. So we talk about the optimum level being where marginal social benefits equal marginal social costs, where we keep production at that same level. So now we come to the concept of deadweight loss, which is where we have a lost level of economic efficiency, where the equilibrium in the market is not achieved. So we have potentially a situation where the marginal social benefits are outweighed by marginal social costs. And we have a situation where the gap between the two is called the deadweight loss, which is the net of consumer and producer surplus due to things like taxes, subsidies, price controls, other externalities that might actually impact more broadly upon the economy. Deadweight loss overall indicates there might be missed opportunities for other types of transactions or for mutually beneficial transactions. Maybe we need to think about changing policy in some way to actually shift how we produce things and the price we produce them at as well. Externalities are related to this. They are the indirect effects of economic activity on a third party. So what we have are two guys in our circle here. They're transacting in some way. They could be the government and a producer, or it could be two parties in society. And in their sphere, there's a mutual beneficial relationship, but perhaps it could still impact upon our person down here in blue. And actually it could be still impinging upon their civil liberties or upon their rights in some way, or upon their own physical safety perhaps as well. A great example would be a new airport leading to benefit for contractors building the airport and travellers using the airport, but our little guy in blue here is next to the airport and therefore he gets more noise from living near the airport. So there's both positive and negative externalities which can be achieved as a result of having an activity in the economy. In order to be able to control how these externalities affect the economy more broadly, and also the balance between marginal benefits and marginal costs, we talk about using regulation. In the context of this module, regulation is any process, rule or legal framework that moderates how the economy functions. It can be taxes, it can be subsidies, it can be rules and regulations as well. It's government intervention in the market to ensure social benefits do not outweigh social costs. For example, smoking has such massive externalities and massive impact upon society, upon people's health, and also upon the activities of the National Health Service, that we need to have some kind of intervention by government. We need to have some kind of regulation on smoking activities to be able to make sure that there is a not too great a cost resulting from having it be illegal. So all markets to some extent are overseen by governments. Governments provide money, provide exchange, provide laws of property that actually facilitate markets. and they're underpinned as well by practices and kind of in society that actually mean that markets operate effectively. If everyone, for instance, just started stealing, there would be mass anarchy and no kind of shop would be able to open properly. But it's those kind of underpinning social contracts that we adhere to that actually mean we can operate effectively and have an economy. There's an emphasis on quality and safety from markets as well. So governments put in place very, very often kind of acts and laws that mean that people can't sell things that are just wantonly unsafe. You can't any longer go out and buy a vacuum cleaner, for instance, that the seller knows will kill you if you use it. There's an intention, therefore, that markets are not allowed to cause excessive danger to society as well, more broadly in terms of their structure. For example, the financial crash was an example of where the market structure itself got out of control. There was no oversight, and it meant that actually the rules of the market themselves led to it being unstable. There are, of course, counterexamples where individuals have tried to construct markets which exist outside of the purview of governments. Bitcoin in 2012, when it was launched, facilitated a way of exchanging money and exchanging value between individuals in a non-monetary fashion which wasn't regulated by governments. That led to the introduction of websites such as Silk Road, which is an anonymous market for the trading in, as we've shown on the screen, drugs, in guns, in all kinds of illegal activities. And as a result, it's only available on the dark web through something like the Tor browser. It's not an openly available societal norm to be able to access Silk Road. One of the flip sides of this is, even though it is illegal, it's operating outside of the purview of oversight of government, the people involved with it have still been arrested. The people who trade on it are caught by law enforcement as well. So there is still some kind of government intervention there. So alongside examples like Silk Road, where they seek to wantonly be outside of the law, there are other limits to government regulation, and these are quite nuanced and quite long-standing in some ways as well. So there's a potential initially for introducing inefficiency, so where governments try to interfere with markets rather than allowing the invisible hand of supply and demand to do its work, there can be areas of inefficiency creeping in, really because the government doesn't know what it's doing necessarily all the time. For example, in the 1970s and 80s, the UK government used to try and choose who would be industrial leaders. It would try and pick industries and pick companies individually who might actually do better than other companies. And it would support those industry leaders to produce things. An example I've got on the screen is from the early days of computing, whereby the BBC Micro was chosen as being, and the company behind it was chosen to have a government contract and a government support to produce microcomputers for schools and for homes, whereas competitors such as the ZX Spectrum by Sinclair were not supported. And in the end, Industrial Council, which is kind of the Ministry for Industry in the 1970s and 80s, actually supported arguably the wrong computer, and in many ways could have actually stifled innovation in that space. There can also be administrative costs to what's happening as well. For example, setting up large swathes of government regulation can be very onerous, very time consuming, and can lead to lots of administration and oversight, which is very costly for a government to do. Governments also are ideologically driven, they're politically driven. That means that they ideologically believe in certain things. Their politics is of a certain bent, and it may not be that it is aligned with the principle of intervening in markets. For example, very broadly, right-wing governments are usually more open to having markets settle themselves and have a laissez-faire attitude towards things, whereas left-wing governments are more about intervention in the economy for particular societal purposes. There may be geographical limits to regulation. For example, governments themselves are inherently, they deal with the space of a country, and it's very difficult for them to kind of add regulations of things which are overseas. All they can do is try to control what comes into their own economy and which is traded within their economy as well. There may be judicial limitations as well. For example, if you have laws which protect certain types of activity and doesn't promote other types of activity, governments themselves can be held to account by judicial oversight. Finally then, we may be looking at a stifling of innovation and entrepreneurship as a result of trying to over-intervene within an economy rather than just allowing it to do its own work. There may be some other social benefits which could be unseen and which may be underestimated by government, which actually leads to a situation whereby we are doing too much to intervene within those economies and actually reduces efficiency again and maybe actually increases deadweight loss. One potential argument against regulation, against government intervention, is the idea of regulatory capture. That is that regulators become too quick to accept the rationale for actions by the companies they are regulating. For example, this can be do with licensing of certain activities or kind of, again, government support for particular industries. We have an idea about revolving door between these companies, between the top tier of certain industries, certain monopolies, certain oligopolies and certain monopolistic competition situations. Those top tier CEOs quite frequently go to work for the government, go to work for the regulator, and go back to those big company jobs again. And we see this revolving door operating all the time at the highest levels of those business areas. And that can be quite undermining for the autonomy of regulators, which should be totally independent. For example, on the screen I've got a clipping from The Guardian, which is a story about the Environment Agency and Ofwat going for a meal with water club bosses who are actually, they're the people that are actually being regulated by the Environment Agency and by Ofwat. And as a result of that, they're opening themselves to charges of potentially corruption or just bias. I think the final points are that we may have groupthink about certain issues whereby people buy into the same kind of logic. And this can also be linked to an ideological bias as well. Perhaps people believe the same things about how the world should be run. Perhaps they have the same kind of attitudes towards unfettered activities by these big companies, which actually maybe isn't necessarily in the best interests of the public. This leads us quite nicely onto an example of some negative externalities. And the biggest one I could think of initially was about water companies. So provision of water is an example of a natural monopoly, i.e. locally we have no choice of who is our supplier of water in any particular town or region. I'm in Wales at the moment and there are two large companies who supply water. UK government in the 1990s decided to privatise, wherever possible, natural monopoly markets to try and find more competition across between regions and bring more money into the industry as well, but also protect consumers by introducing regulators who should make sure that these companies were operating in a way which maximised social benefits and minimised social costs. However, over the past 32 years, Ofwat and the regulator of private water companies has largely been seen to have failed in its duties. Private water companies have increased prices by 32% over a baseline inflationary level, i.e. they have increased prices by a third over what would otherwise have been the case. They've paid out $72 billion in dividends to their shareholders, i.e. payments to the people who own them. They've spent $160 billion on capital infrastructure investments, but they've leveraged the capital they've invested back into borrowing of up to £65 billion over that same time period as well. What this really means is that every decade infrastructure investment has declined, both in terms of the total expenditure that they've put into the system, which is this dark blue line, and also the capital expenditure on wastewater services. And wastewater is one of the biggest issues we've had in the UK in the last few years. In terms of the total capital expenditure every year on year across England and Wales, that is the dark blue line. And we can see by 2021, which is where we've got the last details from the Financial Times, actually it's dwarfed by the net debt level, which is way up in the tens of billions. So actually the amount they've actually invested has been dwarfed by the amount of debt they've accrued against the capitals they've invested in. So yesterday I was next to Barrowfundle Beach in Pembrokeshire, and it's just around the headland from an area where Surfers Against Sewage organised a large board out this summer. Their idea was they wanted to raise as much awareness as possible in an election year to make sure national government was aware that people were holding government and holding regulators to account for poor water quality. Barrowfundle Beach, which I was at, as well as Broadhaven as well, has suffered from excessive levels of raw sewage at different times in the year, which is a direct result of the lack of capital investment into wastewater handling services by the private industry. To that end, Surfers Against Sewage created their own kind of manifesto that they wanted to really highlight the main points about the negative quality of UK water. The Surfers Against Sewage report, which I've just mentioned in terms of the manifesto, highlighted the fact that raw sewage levels in Wales has increased out year on year for the entire time that these private companies have been running it. That means that the marginal social cost of their activities has been increasing year on year. Now, as consumers, we would normally just be able to switch who our suppliers are to one that has less of a social cost as a result from its activities. We'd look for those areas of benefit. We'd move away from companies and activities which are costing us and costing society something. However, we can't do that because they're a monopoly and they're acting in that kind of way, and they have an element of regulatory capture as well. I think this excerpt from the report is particularly interesting, which highlights that many Welsh beaches and rivers are situated in national parks near areas of outstanding natural beauty. But that despite this kind of unique protected environment, these two Welsh companies had still produced over 613,000 hours of sewage discharged in 2022. And that increased again in 23 and is likely to increase again in 24. So sewage water was a good example of a nationally based or bounded issue. A good example of a cross-border or multiple country affected externality issue would be that of acid rain. So when fossil fuels are burned, the released sulfur and nitrogen mixes with water in the upper atmosphere and can create hydrochloric acid. This then falls as rain. And of course, clouds don't know there's a boundary, so they move across European states and they drop their water where they will. The heavy post-war European industrial output led to lots and lots of hydrochloric acid being produced and falling upon particularly North European forests as acid rain, and massive amounts of deforestation as a result of that. Now, this led to a movement by the European Union towards getting countries to work together to legislate for improved air quality standards. And this wasn't a kind of an ideologically green agenda. This was purely about the fact that one country's industrial output was affecting another country's environment and people and forests very, very directly. It's a concrete issue which they could see straight away. And this is an example of where countries started to pool their sovereignty, pool their power together, and pool their industrial strategies together to make sure that several of them weren't impacted by each other's activities. It's been the basis for cooperation for other climate change issues as well in the 1990s, 2000s and 2010s. And actually it's been the foundation of European collaboration on sustainability and green agendas right across the entire history of the European Union and the European Economic Community as well. In this week's seminars, we're going to talk about some more mixed externalities, where there are social benefits and there are social costs. And I think one of the best examples of that would be social media companies and the use of social media, which we benefit from, but there are obviously also costs to that as well. So I look forward to speaking to you in the seminar this week. Just a reminder, the reading for this topic is Sloman chapter 20. However, chapter 10 is really worth reading if you want to learn a bit more about monopolies, about different forms of competition within markets. Thank you.